Hi, everybody. Thank you for making time to attend the inaugural event for the Sexuality and Nationalism in South Asia series. The series is supported by the York Center for Asian Research and the Center for Feminist Research at York University. For those of you who don't know me, I am Shraddha Chatterjee, a doctoral candidate in gender, feminist, and women's studies, and a Vanier scholar at York University. Very, very broadly, my research looks at the entanglements between Hindu nationalism and queer life in India. And I, for one, am very, very excited to learn from our two wonderful speakers who have joined us today. Niharika Banerjee teaches sociology at Ambedkar University, Delhi. She is also an active member of Sappho for Equality, the activist forum for the rights of lesbian women, bisexual women, and transmasculine persons in West Bengal, India. And Rahul Rao is a fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Social Sciences and Humanities and lecturer in international political thought at the School of International Relations, University of St. Andrews. He is the author of Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, and The Third World Protest Between Home and the World, both published by OUP. Thank you both for joining us today and for making, I think, what will be a very exciting start to the series. Dr. Banerjee will be speaking first, followed by Dr. Rao, and both speakers will have approximately 20 minutes for their presentations. We did have abstracts for both presentations, but I'll let the speakers kind of present their work without doing too much of this in the beginning. So let's jump right in, and Dr. Banerjee, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Shraddha, and thank you to the York Center as well. And Rahul, it's great to be with you here. I'll also straight jump in so we have as much time to, to discuss as possible. So I argue for, my paper is titled Homopopulism, that's it. And I argue for nuancing the theorization of mobilization of LGBTQ identities with homopopulism in contexts where queer politics cannot be understood in absolute inclusive exclusive terms. With the rise of the queer sexuality question along with the woman/gender question, LGBTQ rights have become central to nationality and citizenship formation in some places, thereby hierarchizing countries that are backward and forward. From their incorporation in development agendas to recognition of its varying identities and expressions as figures of life, sexuality rights are a primary organizing concern for national states, international human rights organizations, and international financial institutions, as various scholars, including Rahul has argued. States in the global north, international human rights, financial and development organizations use LGBTQ rights and equality legislation as a meter to measure democratic progress and backwardness of nations, as well as to determine and disburse development aid. At the same time, national states in the global south deploy LGBTQ rights to define and redefine themselves around questions of independence, cultural pasts, development, and future growth. Against this backdrop, the popularization of LGBTQ rights in India present a complex scenario. Within the Indian context, homonationalism is commonly used to mark the representation of LGBTQ visibility and rights through nationalist symbols in pride marches, the intensified attachments of the queer body to nationalist projects, and the protection of minority rights, including LGBTQ rights, as one of many justifications behind the revocation of Article 370 in Kashmir. Broadly, Jasbir Puar's now widely circulated term has served to illuminate the liberal upper caste, the middle and upper class underpinning of mobilization of LGBTQ identities in the urban Indian context, including its recent implications for establishing sovereignty. In recent years, Homo-Hindu nationalism, a related term disseminated by Nishant Upadhyay, highlights a set of transnational, Brahminical, and Islamophobic Hindutva voices that propagate the liberation of a purported gender non-conforming friendly Hinduism from colonial homophobia. Thus, both homo-nationalism and homo-Hindu nationalism have served to provide a critical interrogation of the contemporary Brahminical and right-wing leanings of queer and trans-inclusive agendas. And yet, there are ambivalent moments that exceed such inclusions. The importance of homopopulism as an analytical category is connected to unique conditions within post-colonial nation states, where a unilinear connection of rights-based claims to state sovereignty may not work. LGBTQ is not a developmental category in the Indian polity and policy framework, unlike in the United States, UK, particular EU member states, and Israel. Neither does LGBTQ exist as a favored minority. The Indian governmental bodies have not mobilized LGBTQ populations at a scale like the US, UK, EU nation states, or Israel to resolve and or legitimize national or international policy and development matters. Yet, in recent years, bodies are being interpellated as transgender and as LGBTQ in status discourses. Homo-nationalism and homo-Hindu nationalism fall short of analytical productivity concerning a post-colonial Indian context for the following reasons. First, there is a complication in primarily marking queer politics in India through this frame. There are various community-based critiques, micro-narratives of unbelonging, and different imaginations of belonging that get sidelined in this primary explanatory frame. All juridico-political engagements of queers cannot be reified into a simple demand for state recognition. Many micro-narratives are about the right to non-discrimination, freedom from institutional violence and legal reform, and reservations in educational institutions and employment sectors. Legal reforms in countries such as India, to quote Nikita Dhawan, are a result of complex social and legal struggles that produce ambivalent and diverse effects that cannot be equated with homo-nationalism without looking into regional histories of reforms. A heightened focus on the homo-nationalist, homo-Hindu nationalist frame may tend to push out of focus the efforts and issues of gender and sexual minorities, especially those who are economically marginalized, Dalit, Bahujan, and Adivasi, who regularly engage with state actors to create non-discriminatory conditions for a livable life. While the requirements for non-discrimination are not necessarily dependent on the quantity of juridico-political reforms, legal and legislative support is crucial to counter collective forms of violence from and inaccessibility to public and private institutions, which sometimes involves complex negotiations with hardline state actors. Second, there are situations where queer activist practices and experiential narratives do not necessarily follow a clear instrumentalization nor a seamless linear developmental history. Third, the homo-nationalism, homo-Hindu nationalism dual lens cannot explain why LGBTQ identities are being mobilized for specific political projects and yet remain without a livelihood, affirmative action, and anti-discrimination guarantees, all of which are facilitating conditions for a livable life. When historically excluded queer and trans communities place demands on a homo-nationalist and homo-Hindu nationalist state for social and economic guarantees of life, livelihood, and redressal of violence, how does one frame a nuanced conceptualization? How does one read a nation state's projection for inclusion in response to the rights claims of violated queer and trans communities? It is imperative to distinguish between the claim to rights for redressal of violence by queer and trans communities, mobilization of such claims by states to further their exclusionary political projects, and agendas of queer and trans communities with cultural and social capital for uninterrogated assimilation. The template of a juridico-political conversation in a post-colonial nation state cannot have a unilinear reading of alignment with the government. In a context such as India, one must ask how queer and trans persons' engagement with the homo-nationalist, homo-Hindu nationalist state either disrupt or push hierarchies of power to perform for the marginalized and historically oppressed communities. Because of these conditions outlined above, LGBTQ identified bodies in the hierarchically divided social occupy varied positions between life and death in continuity and juxtaposition with pre-colonial, colonial, and liberal rights-based discourses. Homopopulism at this juncture can offer a nuanced and dynamic way to understand the varied layers of the relationship between sexuality right claims and state responses, including but not limited to claims within state sovereignty. In a larger version of this paper, I focus on state responses in the 2019 election manifestos of three national political parties, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, Congress, and the Bharatiya Janata Party as examples of manifestation of homopopulism. I read these manifestos as a response of state actors who, aligned to thin-centered ideologies of national development, use idioms such as empowerment and social justice as a legitimizing move to represent the will of LGBTQ identifying persons in a global terrain of forward-backward states without having to fulfill social and economic obligations. All three manifestos, albeit with some differences, interpolate a certain kind of liberal sexual subject, promising social reforms without little or no discussion as to how or under what conditions enabling social and economic conditions can be created for marginalized queer and trans persons. These promises do not find discussion space for a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy and horizontal reservations in public institutions. When sexual subjects are interpolated to advance thin-centered ideologies without fulfilling essential enabling social and economic obligations that are crucial to living a socially and economically secure life, I understand this condition as populist. By thin-centered ideology, drawing from the work of Mudd and Kaltwasser, I mean that which is malleable, articulating itself with other ideologies such as liberalism and nationalism to promote specific political agendas and projects. At various points in India's post-colonial history, different groups have been mobilized or come in conflict with the state to demand social, economic, and political guarantees and rights to have equal opportunity in public institutions and access to infrastructure. The state assesses many of them like a combatant, evaluating them on the threat they pose and less on their merits, as some scholars have argued. Various political parties with both national and regional influence, such as the Janata Coalition, Congress, CPIM, DMK, IDMK, etc., have mobilized middle caste groups, linguistic communities, and economically marginalized people to further specific agendas claiming to represent the will of the people. The public sphere in India has thus held varieties of populism where interest and identity serve to mobilize people in combinations that are often hard to anticipate, as some scholars argue. There is a complex dynamic between LGBTQ claims for recognition and rights and state responses. Collective efforts to gain redressal from violence, guarantees of livelihood, inclusion in public and private institutions, and negotiating with hardliner states need to be distinguished from assimilative agendas. Such efforts and claims result from long histories of struggles of queer and trans Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi individuals and collectives, some never surface, remaining stifled within deeply gendered and violent households. These have drawn attention to the need for placing queer and trans issues on the political party and policy map that do not begin and end with an uninterrogated need for state recognition and assimilation. How are such claims being noted by state actors? Would it be enough to call these observances attempts at homo-nationalist and homo-Hindu nationalist assimilation, especially when activist collectives and individuals are navigating homo-negative and transphobic states to make them accountable to populations dispossessed and violated? Or is it also imperative to do a critical reading of such promises as part of making states accountable to see what is problematic and unacceptable and what needs amendment? A homopopulist lens allows a critical reading of the political party and policy promises to make state actors accountable to marginalized queer and trans persons and collectives. The Homo Hindu nationalist conceptual duo may not spot populist modes of incorporation, and populist theories of the state fall short in addressing the dynamic modes of LGBTQ incorporation. Homopopulism connects the two, thereby facilitating a nuanced engagement with the process of incorporation. I have come across one academic usage of the term homopopulism. Lauter and Fury deploy homopopulism to understand how emergent right-wing national populist states in Europe and North America, in collusion with queer subjects, are othering ethnic and religious minorities. For the authors, the urgency to understand fear-based patriotism and its connection to the rejection of queer asylum seekers from South Africa necessitates a shift from homonationalism to homopopulism. I see my conceptualization of homopopulism as juxtaposed to the European and North American context. The running thread in both is a particular kind of state response that deploys a register of representation, rights, and forwardness. What then is primarily achieved by a populist reference to LGBTQ concerns? Rights are a focal point around which social actors and institutions define simultaneities with liberal democracies in the global north and difference with other nations in the global south, recently more so around LGBTQ concerns. This is a specific kind of political relationality that is popular precisely because it draws upon a familiar temporal trope of having arrived and not yet arrived, a key way in which third world differences lived and understood around the presence or lack of LGBTQ rights. That India has now joined the list of countries where homosexuality is not a crime was a popular media headline and sentiment that many of us encountered on and right after September 6, 2018. We were reminded that Nigeria, Ghana, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Qatar, Pakistan still criminalize homosexuality. The English language media gave us a short tour of gay rights around the globe and how the world reacts to homosexuality, and we were told that we had now won on the global stage. Along the way, such facts were buttressed by quoting data from the World Values Survey database, a global network of social scientists studying changing values and their impact on social and political life. Thus, the inclusion of the LGBTQ body caters to a normative middle-class respectable Hindu imagination and is at risk of co-opting the struggles of gender sexual minorities to further agendas of forward-backward discourses. Hence, it is necessary to mark and name the populist moments of LGBTQ inclusive agendas and highlight the need to engage with statist discourses to create conditions for socially and economically secure lives. In conclusion, the conceptual and analytical work of homopopulism is not predetermined. It can be deployed in spaces where inclusive promises across left, liberal, centrist, and right-wing states do not lead to legal reforms and affirmative action policies. Homopopulism may help to illuminate those spaces of excess where the struggle for dignity and inclusion cannot be understood as assimilation. Collective efforts to gain redressal from violence, guarantees of livelihood, inclusion in public and private institutions, and negotiating with left, liberal, centrist, and hardliner states in its everyday functioning has to be distinguished from queer and trans complicities with Brahminical and Islamophobic discourses. Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing presentation and also for, of course, keeping time so well. I reserve the questions and I already see some connections with Dr. Rao's work, but we'll reserve that conversation for after his presentation. So let's jump right in. Dr. Rao, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Shraddha, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone who's been organizing behind the scenes. It's really nice to share a platform with you, Niharika. This seems to happen to us quite often, which is really nice. I think my talk follows on quite well from Niharika's because I'm going to throw another homo word into the conversation. This is homo capitalism, and I'm going to try and do this by thinking about its relationship with homo nationalism, which Niharika has already outlined this is, of course, Jaspir Puar's notion of homo nationalism as articulated in terrorist assemblages and as has been taken up in a number of ways, including by scholars of South Asia who have been writing about Hindu homo nationalism. Um, so I'm going to take it for granted that we're all quite familiar with the sort of mainstream understanding of homo nationalism. So I'll mainly talk about homo capitalism and how I think it relates to homo nationalism in both resonant and dissonant ways. So this is an idea that I've written about in my book Out of Time, but also in an article in Radical Philosophy that came out in 2015. And I developed this account of, and broadly, the argument is that we need to supplement the civilizationist logic of homo nationalism with a political economy logic of homo capitalism. So I developed this argument out of a study of the global reverberations of the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2014, which many of you will know earned global notoriety for its draconian provisions and also for the well-documented involvement of US-based Christian evangelical activists who lobbied for its passage. One of the most high-profile global reactions to the law came from the World Bank, which 3 days after its passage in February 2014 announced that it was withholding a $90 million loan to Uganda, which was meant to have funded maternal health projects. So that loan eventually never went to Uganda. India is also emerging as a key terrain for the bank's interventions in LGBT rights. In the same month, the bank released preliminary results of a study estimating the cost of homophobia, these are the terms used in the report, to the Indian economy at between 0.1 and 1.7% of its 2012 GDP. Of course, we can have a very complex discussion about the methodology and so forth, but my argument is less about the methodology than about the stakes of making these kinds of claims. A subsequent study by some of the same authors of 39 countries makes the converse argument that the inclusion of LGBT people, as measured by the recognition of a set of rights enumerated by a certain global index, correlates positively with increases in per capita GDP and a higher ranking on the Human Development Index. So these studies were trying to show that if a country recognizes LGBT rights, its GDP goes up by X%. So the threat of capital withdrawal, that is the bank withdrawing a loan, and the promise of capital infusion, that is your GDP will grow if you behave well, have begun to emerge in parallel with homo nationalism's Orientalist discourses of civilizational superiority and backwardness as a proselytizing strategy for queer liberalism. Now, in many ways, the logics of homo nationalism and homo capitalism resonate with one another. Just as homo nationalism selectively incorporates within the nation what Puar calls gender, race, class, and one must add caste privileged forms of queerness, while disavowing others who are lumped into this figure of the monster terrorist fag. Homo capitalism also holds out the promise of selective inclusion for those forms of queerness that can demonstrate themselves to be integral to projects of economic growth and productivity, while implicitly, and this is never spelled out, but we can see it, relegating others to fates of poverty and incarceration. Besides splintering queer movements, both logics also operate to separate queer movements from what might otherwise appear to be likely allies. So in the face of this kind of discourse, it's more difficult to think of queer movements making common cause with anti-capitalist movements or anti-development movements or of the kind that we're actually very familiar with in the South Asian context. Yet, even as a shared commitment to liberal and political economic values allows homo nationalism and homo capitalism to resonate with and reinforce one another as if they were components of the same assemblage, there are also moments in which they part company. I think they do different kinds of work. I don't think they always work in lockstep with each other. So I want to point to three ways in which we can think of them as different, even if they are sometimes resonant and accompany each other. First, the tropes of civilization and barbarism on which homo nationalism relies do not always work in the way that they are intended to. So, faced with the suggestion that LGBT rights are a marker of civilizational superiority, it's open to the targets of this discourse to argue, as some have done, that what some consider progress is to them a sign of civilizational decay, and therefore to champion alternative orderings of sex, gender, and sexuality as vehicles for their own claims to moral and political leadership. We can see this, for example, in the way and I'm not using this example because of current events, but I actually think it is a very good example. You know, the way Russia champions traditional values discourse at the UN. This has become a kind of umbrella under which many other LGBT rights resistant states and societies have begun to gather. That's just one example. We can also think of the ways in which some sub-Saharan African states have used their opposition to LGBT rights to set themselves up as leaders within particular Christian denominations, whether it's the Anglican Church or other Christian denominations. So dominant versions of homo-nationalism can be opposed by counter-nationalisms that are structurally homologous with them, even if they are invested with morally antithetical content. In contrast, as the space for alternatives to capitalism shrinks, it is arguably more difficult to resist the claim and the seductions of homo-capitalism. Insofar as survival is contingent, and I mean survival in a capitalist system, is contingent on the accumulation of capital, it's more difficult for states and societies to disavow development trajectories that promise capital accumulation. I suppose what I'm saying is that the discursive weight of homo-nationalism can be and is sometimes opposed by counter-nationalisms, but homo-capitalism can be meaningfully resisted only in an anti-capitalist register. And without such an explicit anti-capitalist politics, there is really no prospect of pushing back against these kinds of discourses. Another slight difference, but this is still part of the first part of the argument. While homo-nationalism works when it doesn't always, but when it does, it works through an arousal of anxiety in those who are stigmatized as barbaric, who fear being stranded on the wrong side of modernity. Homo-capitalism relies on a strategy of seduction that promises full entry into a capitalist futurity for those who obey its dictates. Now, there is something incomplete about homo-nationalism's promise, which I think homo-capitalism usefully promises to complete. So we know, for example, from Homi Bhabha's work, from the 1990s, that this strategy of mimicry that one sees in colonialism promises that the native subject can be almost white but not quite, right? It's a promise that's held out but is never really fulfilled. In contrast, the capitalist logic underwriting homo-capitalism holds out the promise, again, however unrealistic or unrealized in practice, the promise is one of a future in which queer liberal subjects will enjoy full market citizenship. To put it bluntly, one can never become white fully, but one can become rich, as rich as, if not richer than. So in that sense, homo-capitalism's seduction is more convincing, and it holds out the possibility of full realization in a way that homo-nationalism, civilizationist discourse cannot and never will. So another way of thinking about this is, whereas homo-nationalism relies to a greater degree on coercion and stigmatization for its persuasiveness, and even then, as I've said, never quite promises full inclusion, homo-capitalism elicits consent with its promise of a rosy future of growth, productivity, and full inclusion on liberal capitalist terms. Now, this is not to suggest that homo-capitalism lacks a coercive dimension. I just talked about the World Bank. Withdrawing a loan is, of course, a hugely coercive way of trying to persuade a borrowing state to do something. But what I think I am trying to say is that the balance of coercion and consent is different in homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism. Homo-nationalism, with its civilizational tropes of superiority, backwardness, barbarism, etc., relies to a greater degree on coercion, whereas homo-capitalism, with its seductive promise of a rosy capitalist future, relies to a greater degree on consent. And so this reminds me of course, Ranajit Guha's famous distinction between domination and hegemony. I think homo-capitalism tends towards hegemony, whereas homo-nationalism tends towards dominance. The second difference that I see is that I think we can see the relative autonomy of these logics, particularly in moments where homo-nationalist discourses have not succeeded in persuading stubborn and recalcitrant states to embrace queer subjects. These are moments that homo-capitalism tends to exploit. So a useful moment for us to think about is December 2013, when the Supreme Court ruled in Suresh Kumar Kaushal that Section 377 would stand, and it struck down the Naz Foundation judgment. One very marginal, but for me quite interesting development that took place around that time was that major Indian corporations responded with these advertisements. And these were advertisements that were critical of the Supreme Court judgment and underscored their opposition to their decision. So I remember the luxury jeweler Tanishq had this ad advertising a set of glittering earrings with the and the products are important, right? This is classic homo capitalist discourse and setting. Two of a kind always make a beautiful pair. Two of the same kind, sort of highlighting the sameness and same sex and the sameness of the earrings. Others invited their customers to come out of the closet. So I can't remember which brand, but there were these come out of the closet ads also. We can see a similar phenomenon at work more recently when, in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests against the state's racialized violence and incarceration, corporations have extravagantly proclaimed their anti-racist credentials. Now, these are, from the point of view of an anti-capitalist politics, these are dangerous but analytically useful moments in which the non-identity of interests between the state and the market become apparent. Vulnerable to attack by the state, radicals can be tempted into alliances with the market against the state. The state looks like an enemy in these moments, and by implication, the market looks like your friend. But what happens when you make friends with the market or when you rely on corporations for progress or progressive advancement is that your own potential to be an anti-capitalist critic is somehow evacuated. The possibility that you might then see the problems that the market poses is, I think, weakened. So queers in this way acquire a stake in the success of capitalism because they see it as a temporary ally against the state. And in this way see the success of the market as tied up with their own liberation. And we can see this in a number of the tropes that mainstream LGBT movements use. The tropes of futurity, of full citizenship, we are tax-paying citizens, therefore we deserve rights, that kind of language. Which of course opens up questions about queers who are either unable or unwilling to be productive within the terms of capitalism for a range of different reasons. And the third distinction, I think, so let me just briefly go back to Jasprit Pawar's work. I think Terrorist Assemblages does contain several moments that recognizes this triangular relationship between state, market, and queer citizen consumer. And Pawar does recognize that the market is a foil for the state, producing consumer subjects who experience this kind of false belonging to the market when the state has rejected them. But I think there is a broader tendency in terrorist assemblages to fold market and national inclusion into one another, as if they always move together with each other. And by way of example, Pawar discusses how gay and lesbian consumers in the US were hailed in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks by the tourism industry, the LGBT tourism industry, which reframes the act of going on holiday as a performance of patriotic consumption that would restore the nation's psychic and economic health. Now, I find that reading very compelling, and I think it's absolutely accurate as an account of how state and market were operating in that particular conjuncture. But I'm trying to hold open the door for moments in which state and market don't work together. And I think that's what I'm really trying to draw attention to. And the third difference I think that I see is that homo nationalism and homo capitalism operate on distinct temporal terrains. Again, to put it quite briefly, homo nationalism tends to be quite a temporally backward looking discourse, whereas homo capitalism is always sort of looking to the future. So let me try and expand on that. Homo nationalism's gendered and sexualized rewriting of the standard of civilization calls to mind earlier iterations of this standard as what Niharika called a meter of progress, a meter of fitness for sovereignty in international society. As several commentators have pointed out, the most recent manifestations of this standard appear deeply ironic in light of earlier colonial history. So this is this well-known historical point that whereas before the Orient was castigated for its backwardness, now earlier it was castigated for its homoeroticism, now it's castigated for being too straight. But in both of these historical moments, it is still the colonial West that is setting the standards of sexual modernity, even if the content of that standard has changed dramatically over a century or more. But so we're often reminded, sorry, I've lost my place here. In the context of that historical debate, we're often reminded that many of the anti-queer laws in the global south today, particularly in the Commonwealth, in the British Commonwealth, are remnants of colonial penal codes. So as a result of this, both the historical ironies and the legal political fact that these laws have been inherited from colonial penal codes, many British activists, well, I wouldn't say many, but certainly a significant minority of British activists I've encountered in my fieldwork have become somewhat embarrassed about talking on the terrain of the past because, one can very easily point to all of these moral problems with colonial history and its legacies, and so prefer the future as a temporal terrain on which to engage in activism. And this too, I think, has been responsible for the shift on the part of some from a kind of homo nationalist rhetoric to a homo capitalist rhetoric. Let's not focus on the rights and wrongs of the past, let's talk about the future. This is the way it's framed. And this is also, I think, partly due to the success of Puar's critique, precisely because homo nationalism has come to be understood so well, and the critique of homo nationalism has advanced so much, and for good reason. I think we're seeing a change in queer liberal tactics, and to me, homo capitalism is a sign of that change. And maybe just one last thing I would say, because I'm running out of time also, is to think about the different contexts of our own conceptual production. So I think, when Puar was writing about homo nationalism, the global context was very much one of the war on terror. This was the immediate aftermath of September 11th. It was about the anti-Muslimness and Islamophobia that was being seen in US geopolitics and the way in which that leached into LGBT politics. And of course, many of those contexts are still alive. There is no saying that this is in any way weakened. But about a decade later, we also begin to have to contend with the structural processes of austerity, of capitalist crisis, of the new waves of structural adjustment that come to the metropolis, as much as they've been felt much earlier in the global south, but they begin to be felt in with renewed vigor in the global north as well. And I think that's the context in which global homo capitalism emerges as a strategy for queer liberalism. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that talk. I think, that was also very, very provocative. And, I think I'm also very excited that both of you have spoken almost in a way like together, because it allows us to really look at how homo capitalism, homo nationalism, and homo populism can in many ways work together, but also in many ways maybe be in tension with each other. Thank you once again for coming in, engaging, speaking to us. And I'm going to look forward to reading more. And I'll also be in touch with you separately. Thank you so much.